Hello, what we're going to be doing today is some puff pastry. I'm going to be showing you two ways that you can then use the puff pastry later on. So what we're going to do is make the puff pastry first, and then I'll show you later on what you can then be doing with the puff pastry. So I have got 250 grams of strong white flour. I'm going to be having 225 grams of butter, and I've got 150 millilitres of water. So making sure that I've measured that out really accurately, the 150 millilitres of water. The strong plain flour, please make sure that you do use the strong plain flour. The reason for that is because the gluten content is higher. Now, the first question for you is, why do we want that higher gluten content in certain products compared to maybe using plain flour in other products? So looking at plain flour, self-raising flour, strong white flour or strong flour, why do we use different flours for different things? Okay. So a pack of block butter, you do need to use the block butter for this, and that's just come out of the fridge, so it's really cold. So do make sure that you've got block butter rather than a margarine type butter. We want the higher fat content. Now for 225 grams of butter, this pack of butter is 250 grams. So all I want to do is take off the 25 grams. Rather than trying to weigh out 225 grams, just take off the 25 grams. There we go. So that can then be put to one side, and then that's the only block butter that I need. So I've also got cling film for later on, and then I've also got baking parchment also for later on. So first of all, I'm going to start off with my flour. Now you can sieve this in, and that's just going to make sure that you get rid of all of those big lumps, and also add air into our flour as well. Now what I'm going to do at this point is, with my 150 millilitres of water, I'm going to add half of it and then slowly add the rest of it. I quite often say this in lessons: if you add all of the water straight away and you find that your mixture is then too sloppy, it's very difficult to then get the balance right. So it's much easier to add the water slowly than adding it all at once. So add half of that. Just going to use a spoon to start with, just to stir around, but I am then going to use my hands. So that is a little bit sticky on my hand, but that's absolutely fine. That will come off very quickly as you work it. So I'm wanting the bowl to become completely clear. So there's a little tiny bit of water left. I'm just going to leave that to one side, and I can always use that later if need be. Just going to wash my hands. So now that I've got my dough all together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that just in cling film and I'm going to put that either into the fridge or for half an hour, and just to get that nice chilled again, or you could put it into the freezer. It's up to you as to which one you want to do. Freezer obviously means that it's just that slightly bit quicker compared to the fridge. But if you're watching anything like Bake Off or anything like that, they tend to put them into the freezer just for speed more than anything else. So whilst that is in the freezer for 15 minutes, what I can now do is just prepare my butter. I have got 2 sheets of baking parchment. I'm going to put the butter into the middle of the first baking parchment. Remember, that's 225 grams of butter. I'm going to put the other one on top. Now, do be aware at this point, what you are going to do is make quite a bit of noise. So this is not something to do first thing in the morning or last thing at night. I'm not sure that anybody's neighbours would appreciate the loud banging that is going to be going on, especially if you're living in a flat. Anybody who in year 9 and even year 10, we have had a go at this lesson. I've quite often had visits from other teachers just wondering what's going on with 10 people banging out their butter. So this does get a little bit noisy, so warning to you, but all you're going to do is just tap out the butter until it is about 1 centimetre thick. You do want to make sure that it is even across the board. What tends to happen when students do this is that they end up with one side that's about 1 millimetre thick and the other side that is about 1 inch thick. So just be aware of that. And there we have it. We've got my butter into roughly the shape that I'm wanting it. What I'm just going to do is trim that. Now, don't do as one student did a couple of years ago where it didn't quite make the right shape, so that she then got rid of all of that butter. So don't do that, just keep it, and all you're then going to do, again, just and what you're wanting is a slightly rectangle shape. Don't worry too much if they're slightly different heights at this point where you've trimmed off some of that butter, but it's just so that it's then nice and soft. So I can then put that aside until later on. Now, with the baking parchment that you've got, don't get rid of it, because you can then use that to line your baking trays later on. So in the meantime, what I'm going to do is finish off just any washing up, wiping down the worktops, getting myself set for the next bit whilst I'm waiting for my pastry to come out of the freezer. So my dough has now come out of the freezer. It's been in there probably about 20 minutes in total now. All I'm going to do is take it off. I'm just going to use a little bit of flour, again the strong plain flour, on the worktop. Leave that for later. And I'm then just going to roll out my dough until it's a good circle. Again, make sure that you're rolling it out even. You'll notice as you're rolling it, it is shrinking again, so you just need to keep working it. As you're rolling it, once you finish rolling it, just turn it slightly. So the same way that we did with the short crust pastry, which was the Normandy apple tart. So if you go back and have a look, we're going to roll it in a similar way. And we're wanting this big enough that can fit our butter in. So that should be okay. What I'm then going to do is just put the butter that I've hit out just into the centre of this. And again, just leave the baking paper because you could use that later on. What I'm then going to do is just fold my dough round the butter. And there we have it. Just going to put a little bit more flour down. Now this is where it becomes a little bit tricky. Now what we're going to be doing is rolling this out. Now what you might have seen in Great British Bake Off or MasterChef or any of those sorts of competitions is that they might have used grated frozen butter, and that's just to make sure that the butter and the dough stays really cold. So you can do that if you want. If you do have a try at doing that, please let me know how it turns out. I'd be really interested to see and hear how that goes. So all I'm going to do now is just going to roll it so that I then have a nice long rectangle. So push down at each end. Just sticking a little bit, so I'm just going to put a little bit more flour on the top. What tends to happen again with students is that they tend to just chuck in a whole handful of flour, and that's not what you want. You want to be making sure that you're just adding a little bit of that. And then just gently rolling this out. I'm just going to move this very slowly this way. So you may find there's little air bubbles, that's okay. You don't want to push too hard at this point because you don't want the butter to be coming through. So you can see that sort of marbling effect is beginning to take place. So what I'm going to do now is just mark my pastry into thirds. So all I'm doing is just pressing lightly. I'm not pressing deep. And I'm going to fold over one and fold over the other. And what we're starting to do is create the layers of puff pastry itself. Now you may find that the butter starts to come through very slightly. If that does happen, again, just add a little bit of the strong flour just to stop that from happening. So again, push down one end, push down the other. And then again, just very gently. Notice that I did that twist, so I've always got the gap or the lining that I've folded over on my left hand side. I'm going to do this a couple of times. Remember that twist, it's really important to remember that twist. So I've got a gap of some of the butter is actually coming through, so I'm just going to put a little bit extra butter flour on there. So I'm going to do this, so that's 3 times, or is that 2 times? I think that's 3 times. I'm going to do this 4 times in total. Hopefully you'll keep better track of how many times you've done that turn. So you can see that this is becoming a little bit sticky. I'm just going to put a little bit of flour on there just to stop that from happening. Because remember that all that the dough is at the moment is just flour and water. And we're just going to continue to do that process. After each time that you've done those 4 folds, you're then going to put it back into the fridge or the freezer. And you're then going to repeat. So this is a really, really good skill for GCSE students. This is something that we do actually with the Year 9s as well, so it's quite a challenging lesson, but it's really good for them to understand the science behind this. So what is the purpose of layering that butter in between? What happens to the butter during the cooking process? I'm just going to fold that up, and the cling film that I used before I'm just going to use again and use that there we go, and I'm going to put that into the freezer actually for a good 45 minutes before doing the same again, rolling it out, folding, and I'm going to do that process another time before I then take it out for that final process, which I'll then be showing you. So I'm just going to do another couple of rolls. Again, making sure that you've got it all at the same level. You haven't got one bit that's really, really small. So at this point, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to half the dough. Half of the dough is going to be used for our savoury dish later on, but I'm going to show you what to do with the sweet dish. So just halving it. And what you might start to see, in fact you can, hopefully you can see this, but you can start to see lots of little lines all the way through, and some of them have actually got the butter. You can see that layer of butter. So that is being kept to one side, and that will be used later on for my dinner. And with this dough, what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll it out thinly. So it doesn't matter about keeping its shape at this point. Just making sure that you keep those layers though. So what I'm going to be making is something called a palmier. And you can see here that I've got caster sugar and I've got the ground cinnamon. And I'm wanting to get this really nice and thin. It is quite difficult, or I'm certainly struggling. But just keep going. And what you're wanting is quite a long sort of rectangle. I'm going to preheat my oven to 180 degrees. So just whilst I'm continuing to roll this out. Just sticking a little bit, so I'm just going to put a little bit of flour down just to stop that. And what you're wanting is one side slightly longer than the other. There we go. So I've got my long side and I've got my slightly shorter side. It would help if you've got this as a slightly straight line, but don't worry if you don't. We'll be able to trim that later on. And it's about 5 millimeters just making sure that you've got it all nice and even. What I'm now going to do is measure out the sugar that I need. So needing 1 ounce of sugar, or 30 grams of sugar, and I'm going to add a teaspoon of cinnamon, and I'm just going to give that a quick shake. So at this point you can just get rid of any of those big sugar lumps. But it doesn't need a huge amount of stirring, just give it, making sure that they're all well combined. Now the next thing that I'm just going to do, we had that 25 grams of butter left over from before. Just halving that, don't need the full amount, and I'm just going to melt that very quickly. Now, if you don't want to go through the whole process of making puff pastry, completely understand. You can buy pre-made pastry in the supermarket. If that is the case, this is where you will start from. So you'll roll out that pastry block and then go from there. With those doing GCSE, I would expect you to have a go at making this yourself, but obviously completely understand at the moment if you're not able to get hold of the strong flour and everything else. But do have a go at this, those GCSE students, or anybody who's in year 9 that hasn't done the food rotation yet, please have a go at this as well. So most of that butter is pretty much melted. And I'm just using a pastry brush. And I'm just very roughly going to pour the butter on. If you don't have a pastry brush, you could probably just use a knife, as long as the butter is well spread over. And there we have. Now all I'm going to do is just sprinkle the sugar and the cinnamon over the top of it. And again, I'm wanting this quite even. If you're struggling in the way that I'm doing it at the moment, do just use a spoon. And there we go. Now what I'm going to do at this point is roll my pastry into the middle from both sides. So I'm going to start at this end. Try and get as tight a roll as you can. using my saved piece of baking paper from before, I'm just going to put that on there so you can see the mark where the butter was. That just means then it just stays nice and then all I'm going to do is cut the pastry into chunks. To make sure that I've then got nice neat ends, what I might just do is just take the end off very slightly and then cut roughly about 1 centimetre You're wanting to make sure that these are all roughly the same size. And you can really see that swirl now that we've created. Make sure that they're evenly spread. Because these will puff out when you start cooking. So just make sure that they're really evenly spread across there. And then that's going to go into the oven for 15 to 20 minutes. Whilst that is going on, you can really wipe down your worktops now, making sure that all washing up is being done. Washing up, you don't get the fun of doing the cooking without then having to do the washing up. So please make sure that you are doing the washing up as you go. What I'm also then going to do is then prepare a drizzle to then go over the top, and that is with icing sugar and water. So I'll get this into the oven, just give this a quick wipe down, and then I'll get going with showing the icing sugar. So what I've got here is I've got my icing sugar and I've got cold water. I've got a spoon that I'm going to be using to measure out that water. Just to remember that I think I said the oven needed to be preheated to 180. That's not the case, it's 220. So do make sure that you've got that. Apologies about that. So hopefully in the editing we'll have got that right. So it's 220 that the oven needs to be preheated to. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get the icing ready. You could serve these instead with whipped cream and sliced oranges if you wanted as well. Makes a really good pudding. So I'm just going to weigh out 50 grams of icing sugar, and then I'm going to add 1 tablespoon into that and give it a good stir. When you're stirring it, make sure that you're trying to get rid of the lumps at the same time. What we're wanting is a really good drizzle as we're going through. So I've just added half a tablespoon extra water into that, and that's then going to give us a really good path. You can see that it's just holding its shape. If you find that you've added too much liquid at that point, you can just add a little bit extra icing sugar. So that is then ready to go after my biscuits come out and my palmiers come out of the oven. So you can see that mine are now done. I've now taken them off the baking tray but left them on the parchment paper, the baking paper. The reason that is that when I then put on my icing sugar mixture, it's going to drizzle onto the paper rather than onto your worktop. So it's just saving you a little bit of washing up and wiping down, because we've done a lot of that. So these are now cool. So you can really see, certainly in this one, you can really start to see those layers bursting through. So all I'm then going to do, just with a spoon, just have a practice. You could do this with a piping bag if you wanted. And then just slowly drizzle. Icing sugar, maybe doing it a little bit more decorative than I am. And there you have it. You have then got your biscuits all ready to go, or your palmiers ready to go. Enjoy. Just the next one that we will be doing will be underneath the video, so you'll be able to have a look at that. The year 10s, please have a go at making the puff pastry yourself. Think about the science behind it. And with the puff pastry, again, this is the sweet version, but actually you could use it for a pie topping, sausage rolls, or many other different things. Enjoy!